All right. Hi, everyone. We are here with Tran, who is the author of She is a Haunting, which is a Catalyst Award nominee for Best Young Adult Fiction. Trang, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your own background, and then a little bit about this book and kind of like what the premise is, how you came up with the idea?
So I'm Trang. I'm originally from Philadelphia. I actually did a whole bunch of other things before started writing books officially. So I studied sociology in college, and then I got my master's in public health and worked as a data analyst for a while. But I've always wanted to be a writer. So my parents are refugees from Vietnam, and so, there's this pressure to have a stable job. And so that's what I focused on for a while until I decided to write a book in the middle of the pandemic. And that's how She is a Haunting was born. So it is a gothic horror story about a angry queer teen with daddy issues who's forced to visit her estranged father in Vietnam and discovers that the French colonial house has sinister plans for her and her family. Um, yeah, so I started writing this book because, you don't see many final girls in horror being Vietnamese American, and that was something I really wanted to see reflected because I'm a big horror movie and a horror book fan, and I was like, there's not much representation for, minorities and also queer folks in horror, and so I wanted to write my own version of a gothic horror story.
Mhm. I love that. I love just the whole gothic like genre mixing with the first gen themes. And there's kind of like two threads of first gen themes because there's like the first gen college student type of theme, and then there's like the first gen in the US theme, and like that kind of back and forth between the motherland and like where
Yeah.
you were born and raised that I think a lot of people experience. And, I think there is this sense that like we're all haunted a little bit by the ghosts of like all these things that are kind of just out of our reach. What made you want to write like this gothic theme or this horror theme book rather than just a straight like, girl goes to Vietnam to hang out with her dad for the summer
Yeah.
story?
So, as I mentioned before, I'm a huge horror fan. And so I just love everything spooky. And I started writing this book, like a week before October. So I was like, it's the spooky season. It's a perfect time to write horror. But I wanted this book to be in conversation with other Gothic horror books that were already out there. And most of the Gothic horror books out there, at least amongst like the classics, are, white, very hetero, very focused on one type of setting, is usually some sort of English setting. It's a castle, a
Mhm.
mansion. But I wanted to speak to the history that, Jade's family would be interacting with, because in Gothic horror, there's just, the past is always haunting you, right? And that kind of drives the story. And so I wanted to focus on a Vietnamese family who had to deal with, all the holes in their history that they had to withstand, all the holes in their family history, the people that they lost and are still haunting them in ways. And of this house in this very real place in Vietnam that continues to haunt them and has sort of an objective of its own, right? And so, yeah, I wrote this book because I wanted to be in conversation with other Gothic horror, but also to be stand on its own and be its own thing.
One of the kind of initial setups in the first couple chapters is the main character, Jade, kind of going a little bit back and forth between her real life in Philadelphia and then this experience that probably isn't something she expected, which is like going to Vietnam for 5 weeks, right, to help
Mhm.
her dad kind of restore this house that you're talking about.
Mhm.
And a couple of the things that she talks about in those first couple chapters are very, very like first gen, kind of
Yeah.
classic first gen things, right? And one of them is having to give up her last summer with her best friend.
Mhm.
Um, and the reason she has to do that is because she needs the money for college, and that's kind of like a big part of the setup. Um, how much of that was kind of drawn from your own life, and how much was just your creative juices flowing there?
I definitely took a lot of Jade's struggles with getting into college and figuring how to fund it from my own experiences, because, being a first gen student, you're often doing all the applications on your own, you're navigating all the financial aid information on your own, and like, you don't have any money. And so it's such a confusing process. And there's really no one else to guide you, particularly if your parents are immigrants and maybe don't speak the language as well as you do. And so you're often navigating that on your own. And so Jade is almost 18, but she's kind of had to be an adult in terms of, how she's pursuing her education and how she's going to fund it, right? Because she doesn't want to bother her mom, who is very hardworking, very busy, and is kind of doing her own thing and is not really familiar with this college process. So Jade really takes it on all on her own shoulders. And that's kind of how she gets roped up in this deal with her dad.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a classic first gen experience of like trying to protect your parents from the
Mhm.
things that like you haven't even fully figured out yet.
Yeah, of course.
Um, Another thing that she, or actually the way that she kind of reconnects with her dad is because of the FAFSA form. And this is very similar, at least like at the premise to, well, first of all, what a lot of first gens go through when they need to go find their like missing parent out there to get that
Yes.
FAFSA done. But it
Mhm.
was also in an episode of Reservation Dogs, which was also nominated for a Catalyst Award, where one of the main characters has to like go find her long lost father because she needs the FAFSA to be done. Have you seen that episode? Do you have
I
any like
haven't, but now
okay,
I must.
yes, check it out. Reservation Dogs as a whole is amazing. That episode is like it's very it's gonna pull at your heartstrings.
Mhm.
Um yeah, so I think another thing that kind of comes up in at least in these first few chapters, because I don't want to like spoil the rest of the book for anyone, but is kind of the reality of like visiting the motherland. I think something a lot of people, especially when you talk to people who spend their summer some other way, right? If you say like, "Oh yeah, I'm going back to Mexico, Vietnam, Puerto Rico, wherever,
Mhm.
for the summer," there's often like an idea of what that is that can be very extreme. It's either like, "Oh, you're going to be in a resort," or "You're going to be in like a slum somewhere."
Mm.
And obviously, Jay's experience is neither of those things, really. So how did you kind of craft like that back and forth that she's going through with like all of her siblings, her mom, her dad, the house, and just the reality of being in this land that she isn't super, super familiar with the way she is with Philadelphia, of course.
Yeah, Jade definitely has this experience of feeling like she's a tourist, where her parents are from and where she technically is also from, because she's lived with this culture also in Philadelphia where there's a Vietnamese community there. But it's not the same, often when you go back, they can just tell that that you live overseas, that you're part of the diaspora. And so for
Mhm.
Jade, she's very mindful as she goes into the situation, knowing that it can go either way, where it's like, people see her as a foreigner versus seeing her as someone who is trying to fit in, but still not. Um, and so I really wanted to give her the experience, a very intimate experience of a place where her family is from. So I didn't write her in situations where she was at a resort or any places where
Mhm.
like where it's heavily touristy. I mean, the area that she visits is Dilac. It is still a very touristy town because that's how it was kind of designed. But the setting is mostly focused on this house in which her family has history. And so I wanted her to deal directly with that history, um, and where her family is from, and what does that mean in the context of like French colonialism and the terrible things that have happened there.
That's great. If y'all hear any noise in the background, that's just my cat zooming around, knocking everything in my home over. Don't mind him. That's just what he does. Um, Want to talk a little bit about your kind of journey as an author. You mentioned earlier that like that wasn't something you initially started out
Mhm.
doing, which I think is such a first of all such a great example for first gens who I think often feel like I need to pick this one thing when I'm like 18 or 19 or 20, and that's gonna set me on the course for the rest of my life. And
Yes.
the reality is a lot of us change careers a lot of different times and
Mhm.
often do things like we never even thought of when we were 18.
Yeah.
So if there are aspiring authors, whether they're stuck in a cubicle somewhere, whether they're, whatever they're doing, what advice do you have for those aspiring authors, especially the first gen aspiring authors that,
Mhm.
want to kind of make that transition?
Mhm. I think the first piece is that it's okay to do whatever you need in order to be stable and safe, because you can't write if you can't eat, and that's the reality, right? And some of us don't have the privilege of jumping right into a creative career, and so do what you can to kind of be safe and stable, and you're still a creative person, even if you're not writing every day. The thing is to kind of maintain your love for the craft, for the art, whatever piece of art or area that you're working in is. So even though I was, working these other jobs that had nothing to do with writing really, I was still writing on the side. I was still writing stories for myself. But I just didn't consider like sort of wanting to be published and making that leap. But if you're, as long as you're nurturing sort of your love for books, your love for reading, all those things, and then just kind of making a plan, like the first thing, the biggest piece of advice is always finish the thing that you're working on, especially with the book, because you can't revise a book that's not written. And so that was my goal, when I took the year off after being at my job for a long time, I was like, okay, I'm going to give myself a year to finish this book and then do what I need to try and get it published. And so that was my timeline.
And what was your process of actually getting a publisher like? I think that's for a first time professional interested in writing, that's kind of like our hidden curriculum. Like we talk about the hidden curriculum in college, and then there's also a hidden curriculum of being a professional in all these different fields. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there sitting on like an amazing manuscript that are like, like, what do I do with it? And is it
Mhm.
normal to get rejected? And like, what's your advice for them on like that process, the kind of behind the scenes?
Oh yeah, getting rejected is like part of the job. So the first thing is, once you have a manuscript, I highly encourage people to have their own small writing community or writing group so that you can exchange with other writers who can maybe give you feedback on your manuscript. So that's part of like getting the package ready. But if you're on the way to be traditionally published, at least, you're going to want an agent. And an agent is someone who represents you, who sends out your manuscript to publishing houses to sell. And so that process is just, a lot of research. So you can look on, like, for example, Publishers Marketplace, which is this website that allows you to see the sales that agents have made, for example. And so you want to find a partner in your career that matches the stories that you write, but also is someone that you want to work with. So that's the very first step, is getting that agent. And then that agent will help lead you through the process of selling and publishing your book.
I know a lot of first gens, we tend to undersell ourselves sometimes. What's your advice for aspiring authors as far as the money side of things? Like, how do you figure out what to take and how to negotiate these things?
Yeah, that's so hard. I think the first thing is realizing that your voice matters and your voice is special. The only person who can write your story is you. Um, but on the business side, that's also something that you would work with your agent to figure out, because we can't really control the type of offers that we get, but we can say no to offers that we know don't match our expectation and what we think our manuscript is worth. And so that's a conversation to have with your agent as soon as the manuscript is sent out, because if it turns out that a lot of offers are coming in, it might turn into a situation where your agent will hold an auction amongst all the houses that are offering, for example. Or maybe you only have one offer, and then you have to decide, how much and how willing you're going to push for a higher offer. And all those things are valid, because at the end of the day, like, if this is something that you want to be your career, obviously you want a a deal that matches what your book is worth, because you're making the money.
That is great advice. I think a lot of us that do academic writing are like so used to the we put more into this than we ever got out of it because you
Mhm.
end up spending more on like an editor and indexing than you ever get in any royalties, but you're just happy to have like the citation or just to have your work out there, your passion project out there. So I feel like this is such great advice for people that are kind of looking in that different kind of marketplace to transition to that. Couple more quick questions because I know you have to run. Um, any favorite pop culture first gen representations? People always talk about the Gilmore Girls and Fresh
Mhm.
Prince, or sometimes A Different World. But do you have any favorite character or moment where a
Mhm.
first gen is represented?
I'm going to choose a book, and it's this book called Not Here to Be Liked by Michelle Kwok. And it is a YA contemporary, and it is about this Vietnamese, Chinese student who is passed over for the editor-in-chief position in favor of someone who is less qualified but more popular than her, a jock. And it's just so good and how it explores, how this student, how this girl kind of accidentally starts this feminism movement inside her school and then has to figure out like what does it actually mean in terms of like what she really feels about the situation.
That is very cool. Gonna check that one out. I have heard of it. Um, Last question, then I'll let you plug like what's coming next for you. But in She Is a Haunting, it's a very specific point of view, which we love because I think a lot of times first gen stories are very flattened and it just becomes this like very basic struggle narrative. Like, you come from some like poor, disadvantaged background and you leave it all behind. It's like that's not actually what it is for
Mhm.
most of us. Um, and so one of the things that I love in the story is that who Jade is like front and center, but that's not like what the story is about at its heart. Like it is about this house and these other things, but who she is as a person is always very, very present.
Yeah.
She's not like a one-dimensional, just like some girl, right? And that's I think also a representation that like we don't think of a lot when we think of Asian Americans. There's like this model
Mhm.
minority myth. There's a lot of stereotypes about affirmative action and how Asian Americans feel about affirmative action,
Mhm.
but um, this is kind of like subverting that trope of like, oh, all Asian Americans are going to be like have this one singular experience and
Mhm.
as first gens, right? So what do you have a message for anybody listening that might be Southeast Asian descent, queer girly, trying to, just
Mhm.
make it to her
Yeah.
first year of college, and get through it and kind of balance all these competing internal and external pressures that there are?
Yeah. So I think the main message that I had for young people when I was writing this book is that, you are enough no matter where you are in your journey of, coming out, of anything like that, because you're enough to be loved, basically, at any stage of your life. And that's something that Jade had to figure out. That, her worth isn't summed up in, how accepted she is by other people, where she goes to college, all of those things. Like, she's more than these labels, and she deserves to be loved by her family and by her friends.
I love that. Chills. Y'all, please read this book. This is probably my favorite book that I've read in the last year. To be fair, everything else I've read is like about carceral capitalism or like my dissertation. But I have been reading a lot of stuff for the Catalyst Awards, all the nominees, checking out the nominees' other books. I think She's a Haunting is probably like my personal favorite. I'm also a spooky girl, so love the
Yeah.
gothic stuff. Um, so Trang, if people want to, well, first of all, what's next for you? Do you have anything else coming out? Are you working on anything at the moment?
Yeah, so I have another YA horror book coming out next year, title to be determined, but keep an eye out. And I'm also working on an adult book right now.
Ooh, is that also a gothic book? Do we get
Yes, I think it's going to be sort of a folk horror slash gothic horror book.
I love that. And if people want to follow your work, if they, want to follow you on social media, your website, do you have anything you want to share?
Yeah, so they can follow me on Instagram at nvtran underscore, or you can always find me on my website, just my name, trangthuntran.com.
Make it so easy. All right. Trang, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was a nice, short and sweet interview, but just full of like so many great thoughts and insights from you. So we really appreciate your time. And in about a week, Ooh, less than a week. In 6 days, we're gonna find out who has won the Catalyst Award for Best Young Adult Fiction. Y'all know I'm, like, kind of biased and I'm rooting for Teens of Haunting, but sadly, I don't it's not a dictatorship, so we'll have to see what the votes say, but Trang, thank you so much for your time, and,
Thank you.
we will be looking out for what's coming next from you.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Trang.